everyone. Welcome back to Reality 2.0. This week, we're back again after only 1 week. And today, I am Catherine Druckman, as I am every day. And joining us...
You sound better. You sound better.
Yeah, I do sound a little better, I think. I have a new microphone.
A lot better. So great.
Yeah. And like always, we have Doc Searles. And like frequently, we have Petros Katoupis and Kyle Rankin. And today... we're going to talk about TikTok. I know that's what everyone wants to talk about, right? But we're going to talk about it from a slightly different angle. There was a recent executive order, and as of September 20th, TikTok is now contraband. And that's potentially problematic, and we're going to talk about why. But I think before we start, it's also probably good to acknowledge a little bit of cognitive dissonance here, because I think personally for me, and I'm guessing that it's the same for y'all, I don't like TikTok. I don't want it on my phone. I don't think it really should be on anybody's phone, because I think it's a terrible idea. And that level of data exploitation, user exploitation is really, the stuff of dystopian science fiction. But that doesn't necessarily mean I agree with forced removal. So with that, I'm going to hand it over, and let's talk about what we think about this executive order.
I'll just throw some thoughts out there, and they come from different angles. I've actually played a bit with TikTok. It's a fun app. I actually like it. I've learned some stuff from it. I have no idea what's being collected about me or about anybody or where it goes. I don't have any idea where it goes. I have some idea of where it goes with other apps that one uses. I would love it. I mean, an open source angle on this would be open up everything and tell us where it goes and what it's doing. I mean, that would be an interesting thing to demand of TikTok. I think the administration's concern is that the data is going to China, or China's stealing. I mean, basically, I think it's the administration's thumb in China's eye. I don't think, I might be mistaken about this, but TikTok is not a Chinese company. It is one that began there, but it actually is somewhat different administratively. I think the TikTok they want out is one that is a US-based thing, but I don't know that for sure. But I mean, my advice to them would be, or advice to Apple and Google is, no, we're not taking it out of our store. Sue us, send in the troops, some other thing. We think that's bogus, because I think it's absolutely wrong, for executive order or not, for the government to tell a company what it can and can't do, or what can and can't be sold, based on not a whole lot of information. I just don't like that a whole lot. And I think it would be an interesting thing if Apple and Google, which are the two app stores that matter, just say no. Or for that matter, TikTok itself says no. We're not going to take ourselves out. And and they're not going to. And let them send in the troops or whatever they think they're going to do. See what happens. Let's have that crisis and see where it goes. I'm 100% certain there'll be a lot of really teed off
people,
but I think maybe that's part of what they're trying to do. I don't know, but that's
I'm concerned about what message this will send, not just to current companies, but future companies, and the government's role in those future companies. I liken it to how some of the other countries, we're talking about China. China, for example, has a very strong control of a lot of the, the industries within its country, and how those industries are allowed to interact with other industries. It's just, I don't like the message this is going to send.
Well, they're trying, in a way, I see the U.S. trying to play China. China wants to ban stuff, we can ban stuff too. We can censor as well as China can, which I think is a horrible idea. I also think that the internet is inherently an open internet or non-national place. It's not an international place. It's an a-national place. It was not designed to have borders. It was never meant to have that. And to me, this is everything China's doing to isolate, their own separate sub-internet behind the great firewall is bad. I'm opposed to that. But I realize, okay, that's how their culture works and all that, but that's not the internet. They're getting what a Chinese friend named Michael ANTI calls the Cinternet, the Chinese internet. And so in a way, what President Trump wants to do is create the US internet, which is not the rest of the internet, and resembles China in the sense that some things will be allowed and some things won't. And that, I think, is wrong. It's an affront to the way the internet was designed.
So a while back, I think Kyle might be able to speak to this better than I can actually, but a while back, some security researchers picked apart TikTok. And I think that's possibly relevant to the conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing. No one has necessarily found anything in TikTok that they haven't found in pretty much any other phone application that is part of social media. I mean, I don't think that any legitimate argument for this happening is a security argument, as much as is like with many other things, security is used as the public explanation when the real reason for doing these things is control. For instance, all of the control that China has over its local market, they established a precedent that a lot of the US companies that do business there have gone along with. And thereby setting the precedent that, Apple and Google, et cetera, will play ball for local rules under local jurisdictions, sometimes at least. For example, in the case of banning Twitter, there have been companies that have wanted to ban Twitter, and Apple and Google haven't necessarily played ball there because there's a concern about people using it to suppress dissidents and that sort of thing. But in other cases, they've been happy to remove apps from app stores based on local rules. And like I said, set the precedent that it's okay to do so. They're willing to do so. So now when the US asks them to do so, they're in very poor footing to say, well, we won't do it here, but we'll do it when China asks us to do it.
Yeah, that is concerning. And incidentally, I believe TikTok still is a Chinese company. There was some talk of Oracle buying them or having some business relationship, but
I'm
not sure where that went.
Yeah, they have a minority share, to my understanding, of the company.
Yeah, they're a Chinese company. They're a Chinese-owned company that formed a U.S. subsidiary that was run out of the U.S., but because the ultimate ownership was Chinese, it's similar to how a lot of large multinational companies have their headquarters in a particular country, then have offshoots in various countries.
So this is one of those things where I hate to be that person with a tinfoil hat on like I usually am, but I when I think about these things, I think about in terms of precedent, and this is this could be a really ugly one, and I wondered if we could talk about why we all think that is.
Well, again, I think it's because whether it could be ugly in a number of ways. I mean, if obviously a platform or a store, which in Apple's and Google's cases are the same, pretty much the same thing, does have some responsibility to keep its aisles clean and keep and vet the products that are running on there and have standards about them. Let's say TikTok was found to be just sucking out lots and lots of private data and using it in ways that nobody's agreed to. And I mean, let's say they were truly acting badly. And I could see banning it for that. But I think it's pretty clear that what the Trump administration wants to do is something that is in a very small way, but a significant way, like China. In other words, it's playing a political game with China, but is also setting a precedent that says, in the sense that Petros is talking about, that sends the message, at least, that in the U.S. government can say what and will not run on your computer, and to me, that's wrong. And again, it's an affront to what the internet is and was designed to be in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably make an argument that, Apple or Google or whoever runs an app store has the right to govern its app store as it sees fit, but without government interference. And as consumers, we can decide that we don't like that model, and we think Apple is being a bully or whatever. But when it becomes the federal government dictating what's in the app store, it gets a little more concerning.
Well, I mean, that's the power and control that everyone has ceded to those companies, and then now we have a precedent that power extends to the U.S. government at least, and possibly other governments too, because we've all sort of accepted that the modern computer isn't necessarily under the owner's control anymore. Mm-hmm. That this is a traditional computer. You could install whatever applications happen to be, could technically run. But on a modern smartphone, you have to get Google or Apple's permission. And the only way outside of that is to jailbreak the phone, to break out of the jail that's within the phone to install whatever you want. But every iteration of the phone, both vendors, it's in their interest to make that more and more difficult. Again, the cover story is that it's for security. It's to stop hackers from getting on your device. But the real reason, the reality behind it, is it has way more to do with controlling what the users can do with the phone. Because when you look at the implications, it has to do with things like, for example, in the case of Google, when you have many Android phones from different vendors will come with all of this third-party software installed that you're not allowed to remove, for instance. And in many of those cases, that third-party software intentionally captures and sells your data. That's the reason why they paid a cellular provider to pre-install the application on your phone. And there's hooks in place to not only to make it so that you can't remove it without rooting the machine. And we've all sort of accepted that this is okay because we're told it's for security. But as this is a prime example of the fact that the restrictions on the individual are way stronger than the restrictions that are on an attacker. Hackers have consistently proven that they can break out of these sorts of sandboxes. But the end user, let's say today that you would like to, starting Monday, you want to start using TikTok and you can't, that it's technically possible, depending on your phone, to maybe root it, to to break out of the jail and maybe sideload it. But then by doing so, you're breaking the security model that both of those phones claim is necessary to keep you safe, and you're subverting basically the entire the sole security mechanism that they have by doing so. And so you're sort of faced with these two options. And we know that with future versions of the hardware and future versions of the software, that the goal is to make it much more difficult and ultimately impossible to jailbreak these computers, again, in the name of security. But the reality is it allows them to control what software you're allowed to have on your phone.
So I think the distinction between distribution of the app via app stores and actually using the app, I think is an interesting one, because it's not technically practical, right? For people who already have the app. I mean, I guess the app stores can remove it if you don't have a jailbroken phone. The second you do an update, there it goes. But my understanding is that there is a date where it is illegal to use the app.
Well, what they're going to be doing is they're extending the current. So they're starting on Sunday. You cannot update if there's an update for both TikTok and WeChat. You can't get updates for them. And if you don't have it installed already, you won't be able to install it through the App Store or the Play Store. Then at a future date, I believe it's at the end of November.
November, yeah.
All of these ISPs and providers are going to be required to block access from within the U.S. to the services that would support TikTok and WeChat. That's my understanding. I haven't dug into the executive order, but my brief understanding of it is that these other agencies are compelled to, companies will be compelled to no longer allow the traffic through somehow. which would indicate sort of like some sort of great firewall of the United States in a way, maybe, to accomplish that. I'm not sure how they expect that to be accomplished. We'll see. I mean, I still see most of this like many of these negotiations as a giant game of chicken, with being willing to burn everything down to be in a better negotiating position. But we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, I am concerned about the implementation of that as well. Like how.
Yeah, that's scary. just thinking about it.
Yeah, well, we live in China now. Whether you wanted to move to China or not.
Or India or Indonesia, because
lots of exactly. Indonesia did the same.
Those are countries that, on a countrywide basis have banned this and other apps, and it's sort of like, all of these governments think that they can put sphincters on the internet, and that's what they're doing, and I think that Kyle makes some really critical points about, in the name of security, because that sort of covers too much. It's they're and the point he makes also, they've made a whole pile of really great points, but that, we've already sold out. I mean, we're already terribly exposed personally. There are so many holes already out there. Our many frogs have been boiled in so many ways already that it's kind of ironic and difficult to pull out this one thing, this exposure to China, and God knows what's happening there, as the reason for doing this. I'm not sure what the U.S. is saying its reason is at this point. Does anybody know?
National security.
Yeah, it's bullshit.
Like Kyle says, it's the blanket excuse for all the bullshit that goes on regulating the internet.
It's a thumb in the eye of China, and China's not even going to feel it. It's like, it's just but they're like every other company that has an algorithm that's looking at what you're interested in and gives you more of that, or what it thinks, or what the robot thinks you want more of. And God knows what's happening behind the curtain. It's just more personalization, more profiling, more of all the stuff that now a lot of movies are being made about. There's one I just saw, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but that's really all about Facebook and Facebook's algorithm, but also Google's.
The Social Dilemma.
The Social Dilemma, yeah. It's a good movie. And I know a number of people in that movie, right? Tristan Harris, who's the main guy, the former chief ethicist for Google, and a title he gave to himself because they asked him to, and they make a good case, but TikTok's no different in that respect. It's busy hacking you. You watch a lot of Lauren Gray, one of the, I don't know who that is. I just read about her, but she's popular. So you get more of that, right? And then other people get more of that, and a whole kind of cult develops around that person, or a cult of interest. But the same thing happens with politics. And I have no idea where politics is on with that. I've just read here that the Biden campaign has just said, we're not doing anything with TikTok. Please get it off your phones for anybody who's involved in the campaign, because it's radioactive at this point. They just don't want, it's just not an issue they want to participate in, I think. But that makes it political, right? It is a political thing. And I don't like politics being played with the internet. I mean, it's like playing politics with gravity.
Well, it started as a political thing too, because at least if you go with the circumstantial timing of when sanctions were announced against TikTok originally, it was timed shortly after the Trump's Tulsa campaign rally, where there was this army of TikTok people that tried to subvert it by registering all of these seats that they had no intention of filling, that sort of thing. And then news came out afterwards about how some K-pop stars and TikTok users combined forces to sort of spam the rally registration. And maybe a week or two, if I have my timing right, I could be mistaken, but I didn't hear anything about sanctions against TikTok until maybe a week or two after that became national news.
Yeah, I recall that. I remember that.
About right.
That sounds, pretty accurate, around the same time.
Yeah, I want to say the first talk of a ban or the government taking action against TikTok was in July-ish, and I think that was around that time.
Yeah, so I think it's really more, it could be as silly as retribution for that. You know, like everything else, you can squeeze a lot of things through the door if you blame security. And this is another good case. You find out, oh, well, this, you know, even though this is a U.S. Entity, you know, it's owned by a Chinese company, therefore national security, therefore we need to block it just in case somehow someone would gather data. But then the implications of what that means for all of the, imagine if you're neither in the US nor in China, but say you're in Europe, and you look at this and say, okay, but how about the 50 other apps that I have installed on my phone that are from US companies? And we know that the US happens to have a couple of capabilities to do things. And you know, it's not like they're necessarily feeling any better one way or the other by one out of the 50 other apps that are gathering data doing this, you know, being blocked.
Right. Well, so that's I was thinking about your blog post. Your phone is your castle, which I think is relevant to this conversation. Yeah, I mean, why just that? You know, why are we building a fortress against this one and not the others? Well,
and that's the thing is, as I started writing that, as I was writing that with the idea of your phone is your castle, like your home is your castle kind of thing, and going along with that metaphor, I started thinking about the metaphor a lot, and then, you know, realized, well, you know, it's kind of like a castle for most people, except that you're not in charge of the castle. You can't control who comes in and who leaves. You can have merchants who you didn't want come and bother you any time of day, and you're in this room that's very secure, but the only things you can have in the room are things that the owner of the fortress says you can have, and if they decide it's contraband, they can revoke it at any moment. And so, you know, that you may call that a fortress, or you may call that a prison. You know, I mean, if you're not in control of the situation, and you're ceding control to someone else who maybe you believe is benevolent. But yeah, people have already signed up for this, have ceded control to other companies, either for convenience or because they don't have a choice. You know, they don't believe that they have any option but to do this, and by the line that it's for their security. But yeah, there's no individual control, and you don't have the same control that you had with a personal computer, where you could say, oh, I want to use a competitor to the vendor I bought my computer from on this computer. You know, in the past you could do that, and if someone were to block that, it would be considered antitrust. But now, if you have one of these app stores, you can potentially block a competitor if you want, and may escape scrutiny. Apple's done that in the past by blocking email applications on the iPhone because it competed with their native apps and other things like that. The same thing with the parental control apps that they shut down briefly in the name of privacy for 6 months around the same time they launched their own parental app. And then once they got pretty good market share, then they just sort of revoked the ban and allowed them to come back in.
So Doc has some a little background with the castle analogy as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because
Castle Doctrine.
Yeah, well, actually, and Kyle sources some of the same people on the Castle Doctrine. The Castle Doctrine has been around a long time. That, you know, your home is your castle. And what I like that Kyle's made the point that your phone should be your castle, because it's like part of your body. It's sort of like I have a prosthetic arm, but it's my prosthetic arm. It's not somebody else's prosthetic arm, right? It isn't prosthetic arm as a service. It is mine, right? And but your phone is not that. I mean, it's the phone companies, it's Apple's or Google's, it's all of the app providers, and in certain fundamental respects, because it was never the castle that we thought it was in the first place, it is not fundamentally ours. We feel like it's ours, we use it like it's ours, but it's really not, because we never put in the true security functions in the first place that basically say, I'm going to be the one. You agree to my terms, not I agree to yours. You know, I'm not even going to download an app that doesn't agree to my terms. One of which is you're not going to give my data away to somebody else. You know, for example, I mean, there are any number of very simple, I think, or simple enough terms that we might have that others could agree to. but we never did that. We set up in the first place on the old industrial model where we are always the lesser party agreeing to the greater party's terms that we don't even bother reading because we have no power and we need the damn thing, or we want it too damn much. And I love that the Librem 5 is maybe the only phone that of any substance that does what that actually is yours. And I'm fairly close to getting one myself. I really want one bad. But to go back, I mean, your phone is less a phone than a collection of apps, and TikTok is utterly not unusual in the sense that it has an algorithm for driving engagement, and for that reason, there's no way to avoid everything that everybody's got their pants in a wad over. You know, the addiction, the you know, you get addicted to it. You have unwelcome content that has to be monitored, fake news, misinformation, you know, all the privacy concerns, all of that stuff is caused by the very design of these apps. It's caused by the design of the way Google works and the way Facebook works and the way that TikTok works and the way that Instagram works. You get more of what you click on. You get more of what you pause to look at for more than a few seconds. And, you know, of Twitter works the same way. You know, you have to constantly kind of hack Twitter to make it show you, for example, the most recent rather than the thing that thinks you're interested in. And there's no way around that unless we build a castle. That's my case, is that, you know, we have to build a castle. And having governments ban things or punish people for looking at the wrong thing or punish the companies for doing what they can't help doing because by design they're meant to do that. This is why you know, nobody says that, by the way, in the social dilemma. You know, they can't be fixed. And everybody wants to, well, let's get the government to come in here and fix this for us. Well, we'll just ban the right thing, or we'll force Facebook to monitor what everybody's doing. You got 2 billion people loading in whatever the hell they feel like. You can't fix that. And then you drive engagement. You can't fix that. Then somebody reports, well, somebody put up an ISIS video. Okay, then we'll look for that and then we'll get rid of it. But by design, these things only, you know, exploit vulnerabilities that are there because they weren't designed into the first place by making the phone or your computer your castle.
So what can you do about it? I'm sorry, go ahead, Kyle, with your thought.
This goes to the question, what can you do about it? I mean, part of that has to do with incentives. You know, the reason that those companies can't change is they have been built around incentives. The financial incentive goes in the opposite direction. You know, if every incentive points toward collecting as much data as possible, because there's a theory that it gives you more relevant, you can get more relevance and direct more relevant content to somebody that then makes you more valuable to the people paying you to show ads to those people. You know, I mean, that financial incentive is always going to be more powerful than a regulation, because it goes to, why does UPS double park all the time in the city?
Yeah.
Well, they've done the calculation that it would be way more expensive for them to find a parking place all the time than it is to pay the occasional fine from one of their drivers for double parking. So it's just the cost of doing business, you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. In the part of Manhattan where I should say we used to live, we still have an apartment, but we're not there. Double parking on Broadway and pretty much everywhere is pro forma. Everybody does it all the time. It's and it's part of just the way civilization works. It's but you can't do that downtown. You can do that uptown. You can't do that downtown. But the thing is, there, I mean, here in the physical world, you see what's going on. You see somebody's double parked there, and you can kind of read it. You know, you look at it. Is there somebody sitting in the driver's seat? There's not. Okay, they've gone inside. There is somebody sitting in the driver's seat. Maybe they'll move. Maybe this is here just for a couple of minutes. It's a UPS truck. Chances are it's just going to go in a few minutes. But online, you don't know. And by design, you don't know. And even the people involved in it don't know, right? They hardly see what the machine is busy doing. And the financial incentives,
you're not allowed to know.
They're not allowed to know. I mean, you look at what the GDPR did, and for that matter, the CCPA is probably going to end up being more effective just because it has imposed a cost to data collection that is aversive for the companies. Like, maybe we really don't need this data, but it's not going to affect Google and Facebook. It's going to affect a lot of smaller players. But in Europe, for example, I mean, they're still collecting your data. They're still collecting it all over the place, because there's a loophole in there called consent, and another loophole in there called business purpose, or whatever it is. I forget what it is, but it's basically, we have to do this. We can't live without it. But there's a multi-$100 million or euro or pound business in compliance to the GDPR while violating its spirit. And that's because, as you point out, the business incentives are on the other side, and they never took those into account. They would come into account if they actually prosecuted all over the place. But I think even a Facebook or a Google could be laid, like a multi-billion-dollar fine, and they'll still be fine. So I don't know, but
and they have, for instance, there was a case where a new case in the UK against Google YouTube for marketing to children, which in terms that aren't allowed under UK law, was essentially based off of them being convicted in the US for violating a similar law. And they paid the fine, and I don't necessarily see that they changed too much to fix that going forward, but they certainly paid a fine, and then UK's seeking a similar remedy because I suppose you're not allowed to market to third. So there's a good Ars Technica article about this that essentially said out of one side of their mouth, they were telling everyone, yes, we don't market to 13-year-old and under, because that would be illegal. But then on the other side, to the advertisers, they talk about the large market share they have among that demographic and how many hours per day those advertisers would get eyeballs based on that age.
Yeah, I mean, we have these machines for doing that kind of thing, and they're gigantic, and they make a lot of money, and it's pretty hard to change that. But I mean, there's also a side of me that says, if you want to look at porn, if you want to look at just, somebody dancing, you want to look at somebody lip syncing or whatever else they're doing, so what? Again, it comes down to what's okay with the individual. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of individuals, being constantly profiled and included in a cohort that likes a lot of this person or that person's music or dancing or political opinions or whatever else is okay. So that's a problem too. And I don't know if that's a fixable thing.
Yeah. And I think part of it also is it's hard to define. We talk about harm a lot. I don't know, but it's hard to define when you're talking about any sort of online media of any kind. Even in some cases where there is clear harm, like for example, the social dilemma, making, the way that content is delivered literally affects people's psychological well-being, or it affects the outcome of elections, as we saw in the recent Facebook memo or whatever. But even when there are clear cases, it's still really hard to define harm when you're talking about content, because maybe it's just a generational thing or an American thing, but I think most of us are raised with the idea, valuing freedom of speech and whatnot, and it's hard for me to accept that content in and of itself is harmful, because it really should be up to the individual to process. But I don't know. I mean, I think where that starts to fall apart a little bit, based on the capabilities of technology recently, but at the same time, it makes me uncomfortable or that there would be legislation about it and hard and fast conclusions be made based on what is merely content. But I don't know, maybe I'll have different ideas.
How's this? 20 years ago, you couldn't ban an app. Now, the best you could do would be to say that company cannot sell let's go 30 years, because that's when software was in boxes on a store shelf. Mm-hmm. 30 years ago, you may have said, okay, company, you're no longer allowed to sell within the United States, but you couldn't also go through and have the ability to go to everyone's computer in their house and uninstall that software, right? That would be unthinkable that power's there, but that power's there today. If the only reason that TikTok and WeChat aren't being removed from everyone's phone on Monday is because the executive order didn't say to do so. The power, the ability to do so is there.
Right.
It's just simply not being done, I believe, because again, this is a game of chicken, and they're waiting for someone else to blink first, and they're willing to burn it all down. But and it'll be easier to come back if they're not, all the apps aren't removed. But the power's there. Apple has demonstrated in the past by removing, even internal Facebook tools from Facebook employees on Facebook iPhones in retaliation for violating one of the privacy policies. So they've shown that they can do it.
Right.
So the question is, well, when will they do it, and when won't they?
Right. And they've done it. And it goes both ways. Oh, sorry, I thought you were done. But it goes both ways. Yeah. They put a U2 album on Apple devices years ago. I mean, so it's not completely. Yeah. It's not even out of the ordinary, really. And I think also it's the boiled frogs thing. If all the apps disappear from everybody's device on that scale with that popularity, I think the frogs are going to jump out of the water. I think that would be a concern.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, yeah, and so, and ask anyone who has an Android phone, that's not, say, a Nexus device, even if it's a Nexus device, but ask anyone with an Android phone the kinds of junkware that gets pre-installed. It's sort of like the old school Windows days, where you would get a laptop from a vendor and it had all this, in some cases, actual literal spyware pre-installed that would pop up the moment that you installed your, and so you talk to an IT professional and they say, well, the best way to install Windows is to install it from scratch. So you don't get all that junk that comes along with the vendor, right? But Android phones in particular are the same way today. And if you the difference is, at least on a Windows PC, you could go in and uninstall all of that stuff in the olden days. But on Android, you can't, unless you root the phone, jailbreak the phone in most cases. If you have, some like NFL sponsored game pre-installed on your phone because your provider decided you needed that really badly, out of the goodness of their hearts to give you that free game, you can't uninstall it. The OS doesn't allow you. And what is that for hackers? To protect you against hackers? Is that really for security that you're not allowed to uninstall applications on your phone? I don't think so.
No, in the 1990s, I used to work at the tech bench, or the service department for Best Buy. And we used to charge customers buying new computers money to remove that bloat from their new Windows PCs.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Wow. Yeah.
There can be a business model, there will be.
It's funny. I have a friend who worked for Samsung. He's now got a new startup. He's gone from Samsung. But a couple of years ago, when I was talking to him about it, I said, I'd love to get a Samsung phone, except everybody I know with a Samsung phone hates the pre-installed Samsung apps and that they can't get rid of. He says, we're going to work on that. We're going to get rid of that. And he left that company almost like a broken man. And that's around his work, because they never did that. There's one thing they could never get rid of. I haven't looked at a Samsung phone to see if that's actually happened. They've actually taken those things off. There was actually a name for it. It wasn't bloatware, but it was some Samsung specific thing, because that's their practice. But they're not the only one that does it. I'm sure all of them do it on the Android side anyway. And Apple does it too. You can't get rid of on Apple.
Well, yeah, in the physical space, it reminds me. So in the town I live in, there's this beautiful Victorian mansion right in downtown. That as I live within walking distance, so we would just sometimes go on walk down the street. And one afternoon when we were walking by, we saw an open house sign, and I thought, whoa, this ancient, this Victorian mansion sitting here, I have to see what it's like on the inside. And so we go in and start walking around the open house. And right when you walk in, there is this black and white photo of this Victorian era woman on right as you walk in the front door. And come to find out as we walk through and start talking about the house, etc., that one of the requirements in buying that house, so apparently the woman that originally owned the house was heavily involved in the occult, like a lot of people in that era. And she made it as a requirement after she died and sold the house, that anyone who bought the house afterwards was required to hang that photograph in the entryway in the house for the rest of their whoever owns the house from that point on. Yeah, I mean that's a physical space version of everyone's Android phone right now. You have some sort of creepy occult app on your phone. Yeah, that you can't get rid of. That's required to be there for you to walk in the door.
Yeah, it's actually more like you have one of those, and you have 2 or 3 of those in every room, right? You know, it's.
And they have cameras through the eyes. It's like one of those.
Oh
houses, where the eyes follow you.
Funny. It's funny. I was actually involved in a transaction in the exact same way. I bought a piece of property from a nonprofit, a historic preservation nonprofit, and we both agreed to put it in the deed that a building must always in perpetuity be maintained as a historic structure. So you can't tear it down. You can't, because it was the oldest building in the county, and I agreed. I didn't want that to ever happen. So, I mean, there are other examples in the real world.
It's an interesting thought.
I don't own it anymore, but
it's funny because apps. I mean, it used to be in the age of boxes, or even in the age of CDs and online downloads before there were automatic installs, that installing software was a chore, right? And it was actually a good thing in some ways. You had to be very deliberate about wanting an app on your device, at least in the consumer world. And that's completely gone. I mean, it's like everything is just provisional. It's like your phone is kind of a whiteboard onto which other parties can write whatever they want and then erase it and write something else there and erase that and write something else there and then promise to keep your data intact. Which is yours, but you can't, do much with. You're still exposed in some ways. It's an interesting question. I mean, whether the Librem will be a good enough model for the world. I'm interested to see how that goes, because it's a better model.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, we have the open. To us, at least, we view like the openness as an advantage because we don't have to profit off of everyone's data, besides the fact that we are actively opposed to doing it. But because the profit motive isn't there where we have to, then it frees us up to do things that would be unthinkable for other companies to do. For instance, it's definitely not, in our financial best interest to make a phone that has lifetime software updates, for instance. Both phone vendors and cellular providers have this sort of handshake agreement that everyone should buy a new phone every 2 years, maybe 3, and it's enforced in many ways by abandoning the phone when it comes to software updates. So at a certain point, if you care about security, then you must get a new phone, because if you don't, they stop providing security updates, right? And in many cases, otherwise the phone would work perfectly fine, but you need the updates, and so you have to buy. Apple's definitely better in this regard. There's a lot more longevity on their platform compared to Android phones, but all the same, there's a certain point in time where you're not getting updates. So it's in the cellular provider's financial interest to be on that 2-year cycle, because that correlates with a 2-year cell phone contract cycle, right? And then they can say, well, if you sign a new contract, you can get a subsidized phone. A brand new phone, and then lock yourself in for 2 more years. And it benefits the hardware vendor because they get to sell a new phone every 2 years to everybody on Earth. And there's a lot of people it doesn't benefit, because those phones often end up in a landfill somewhere as e-waste. The financial, it's financial incentives. The financial incentives are all there because we're sort of free from a lot of those forces that would otherwise require us to do that, because profit isn't, we can put our social purpose above that, I guess. And so it frees us up to do the right thing, even if it's not the most profitable thing.
Well, I think on that note, we can probably wrap it up unless anybody has any final thoughts.
Who knew? Well, I have one final thought. Who knew that portrait mode video was going to be so popular? I mean, that's
yeah, I have such, I don't like it.
Me neither. It bugs the crap out of me.
It bugs me because especially when somebody is shooting, for example, we've had this in California a lot. You're shooting a fire. The fire is mostly horizontal. It is landscape. It is literally a landscape, and they're shooting it vertically, and then a TV station show it, or it's on YouTube or some other thing. And here's this kind of blank area on either side, and then they actually kind of blur that in a way that, like, there's some algorithm or something that says, we're going to take something that's in this picture and kind of mush it over to the sides and frame it with this junk. But essentially, you've got something that takes up a third of you have a portrait mode that takes up a third of a landscape screen. And it not so much kind of violates an unspoken law of rectangles, but which says, you know what, the world is essentially a horizontal thing, but it is a landscape thing. But portraits are not. I mean, if you're looking at other people's faces, or your own face, that's a vertical thing, and that's what people are doing on TikTok, and they're doing it on this other stuff. It's kind of an interesting new convention.
I think it's iPhone and desktop have taken over portrait and landscape.
I think that's probably
there's no more portrait and landscape. It's just
yeah.
There's no concept of what it's for.
Well, that was the clever idea behind it, because instead of constantly making you turn your phone sideways to consume content from this application, they just default to making it portrait.
Right.
So you're using the phone in the default orientation. I mean, it makes a lot of sense as far as driving adoption on that platform. It also shows that it's really only intended in that case to be, a phone application, because that's what it's designed for.
Here's a weird thought. Let's say Apple or Google or somebody decides, you know what you really need is a square handheld, perfectly square, same on all sides. And then it has a camera in it, and you're looking at this square. What does that do? All of a sudden we look at a square everything. In a way, that was what Instagram did. Instagram kind of defaulted to square for a while, or maybe it still does. It kind of likes square things. But I mean, the weird thing, the cool thing about the portrait mode is that that's how you hold the phone. I mean, you hold the phone because of the way your hand is built. But if you want to look at it in landscape all the time, maybe 1,000 years from now or 10,000 years from now, humans will have evolved to having hands that are good for holding a landscape on their phones. It's an interesting question, because these things are kind of extensions of ourselves. And as Kyle pointed out, there's an expectation we're going to get new ones every 2 years anyway. I think the average life expectancy of a given one is 18 months or something like that.
I stick it to the man and hold it on for 3 years.
Yeah.
Or hold on to it for 3 years.
I tend to as well. I mean, if I hadn't dropped my iPhone 7 in a pool, I'd probably still be using it.
All of this reminds me of a conversation I had recently, and it's totally a topic for another show, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. But have you ever seen the way a person with vision impairment uses a touchscreen phone? If you haven't, you should look it up. It's really mind-blowing, especially if you do any kind of work that involves usability of any kind from any angle. Just look it up, and it's very educational. Watch it.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah,
the people I know who are vision impaired generally hold it like 2 inches from their face. But of course, you could use your nose as a kind of a pointing device, because your nose is warm like your finger, and it's working off heat, right?
Sort of like my children, they keep the screen 2 inches away from their face. And I always say,
visually impaired was the wrong, but more severely visually impaired, possibly blind, if not completely.
When I was a kid, everybody said, when TV came along, you're going to make yourself nearsighted by looking at the TV. And we've discovered since that what really makes you nearsighted is reading. It's like, books and magazines and other things like that. Actually, nearsightedness is adaptive that way. This is open to some debate, but not much anymore. But there we are, that's...
Okay. Well, that's an interesting final thought. So I might as well reiterate again, we are a two-way street. We do have that email address, info@reality2cast.com, if you want to drop us a line about anything at all. And otherwise, thanks for listening.
Indeed.
And thanks for joining us, Petros and Kyle.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me anytime.